Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30 and repeated at 4 o'clock, Then at 4:30 you get last week's episode shown to you as well. Also check us out on my website, that's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. You'll find this episode of Wichita Liberty TV along with all the old episodes, show notes for each episode, and also all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So today, we're continuing to take a look at our candidates for governor this year in Kansas. This week, our guest is Jeff Caldwell, who is the Libertarian Party candidate for governor, and his running mate for lieutenant governor is Mary Gelt. So Carl Peter John, our co-host, thank you for being here. And Jeff Caldwell, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, very good. So give us a 2-minute pitch as to why we should vote for Jeff Caldwell for governor.
Sure. My name's Jeff Caldwell. I am a 32-year-old Johnson County citizen running for governor of Kansas. I've been involved with the politics since 2010. And so I participated within the political spectrum of getting people elected, volunteering for presidential campaigns, passing legislation. So I've been behind the scenes actively working in order to move forward a libertarian progression in the state of Kansas. Mm-hmm. That being said, I had a lot of people outside the political spectrum come up to me and say, hey, I'm not being represented in Topeka. I want you to run for governor. So I am actually running for the average Kansan who's not being represented in Topeka right now. I am running to cut crony corporate government spending, abolish the spending that influences the way politicians vote, along with lowering private property tax. I'm the only candidate running for full legalization of cannabis. I will issue an executive order to prevent the state from discriminating against the LGBTQ community. So I bring together the left and the right ideologies with limited government. And I want to make sure that each citizen has a prosperous future in Kansas. I want to bring revenue back to the state, more jobs, and I want to ensure that you have a prosperous future as well.
You know, there's been polls throughout the years. The most recent one I found was a Gallup poll from 15 or 16 that shows that when they ask people, how do you feel about specific issues, that there's quite a few, maybe 20-25% that have libertarian-based ideas, but libertarians have a lot of trouble getting people to vote for them in anywhere that number of a percent of voters. Do you have any idea why that is, Jeff?
Well, I actually had a few people today actually think that the Koch brothers are associated with the Libertarian Party. Mm-hmm. If that were the case, I bet that we would be able to get at least 25% or more because of the money. Mm-hmm. Right now, the Libertarian Party is, in comparison to the Republicans and Democrat, a poor party. We don't have very much money. It's very hard to get our brand out there. It's hard to make sure that people are aware of the candidates because we lack the funds. And so that's where we need to branch out and connect with people who are influential in order to raise more money and to get our brand awareness out there.
Well, we should note that David Koch was a Libertarian Party candidate for vice president.
Yeah.
A long time ago it was.
Back in 1980.
Yeah.
And the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, have many libertarian ideas and policies that they support, but they generally support mostly Republican Party candidates, although they're changing that a little bit this year. So, Jeff, let me ask you this. Is the two-party system just too strong? Are there alternative voting systems that might allow Libertarian Party candidates to get a bigger chunk of the vote?
Well, you know, more and more people are actually becoming more aware of how corrupt the two-party system is, where they are not representing the average Kansan. So because of social media, I actually had a post that went viral on 420 because my campaign merchandise has a leaf on it. And it actually reached over 500,000 Kansans. I'm not really too sure how it stayed so secluded to Kansas, but we actually had a viral post that reached a lot of people. So I think with the way technology is advancing, it is possible that we can shift the tide away from the two-party system to bring in a third party. But I do like the idea of ranked choice voting as well. So if we do have ranked choice voting, that's where you're not supposed to have an R, a D, or an L next to their name, and the citizens are supposed to be well aware of what they represent on the ballot and pick their favorite winners and losers.
Well, you can rank your candidates by choice.
That's right.
And this, I think, helps because I do vote for a lot of libertarian candidates for office, and I'm always told, Bob, you vote for Gary Johnson for president, you might as well just stay home. You're just throwing your vote down the toilet. Ranked choice voting would let a person express a preference for Gary Johnson, and then as second choice, maybe choosing either who would a libertarian vote for between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? It's hard to make that choice, isn't it, Carl?
You could have written in somebody else.
Right.
You know?
Well, anyway, I know Carl's got a question here, but we're out of time for our first segment, so let's take a commercial break and we'll be right back. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with our co-host Carl Peterjohn. Our guest this week, Kansas candidate for governor, Jeff Caldwell. Carl?
Jeff, question, the basics of a political party or candidates. We've got 125 Kansas House seats up this year, 4 congressional seats, a half dozen statewide offices, and how many libertarians are running for political office are the folks going to see on the ballot in November?
I believe it's about 28. We had 28 people sign up to run for office this year.
Let me build on, you talked about supporting full legalization of marijuana. In other states that have done this, they've involved taxation. Now, libertarians and taxation are a bit of an oxymoron in a sense. Your position on legalization of marijuana, and do you support taxation of marijuana if it is legalized?
So, as a libertarian, I don't like the idea of taxing cannabis. However, I am running in order to implement the legalization of cannabis in order to fund the school funding increase that was mandated by the Kansas Supreme Court, because I believe that is the issue in order to get cannabis legalized. We, from a personal liberty perspective, are compromising in order to bring forth the personal freedom in order to consume cannabis if you so choose. And I don't believe that it is something that is an option to the public to not tax cannabis, but then to have it freely grown. I don't think that's a very popular position. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I don't believe that we should work towards at this current moment. I think we need a stepping stone in order to get there. But we also have to cut government spending to also get there as well.
Well, some people think that legalizing marijuana would be a magic shot to the Kansas budget. I've looked up, of all the different alcohol taxes we have in Kansas, it raises about $120 million a year. It seems unlikely that no matter how much marijuana is taxed, it would raise more than that. Mm-hmm. And $120 million
cigarette taxes
a year,
is similar.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
It's, that's like a very small percent of the Kansas budget. So it would help, but especially a lot of people who would be using marijuana are going to do it for medical reasons, and we don't tax pharmacy drugs in Kansas, so why would we tax medical marijuana? Carl, I'm stepping on you. Go ahead.
No, that's fine, because we hadn't differentiated between medical marijuana and marijuana legalization. But it raises the broader question, Bob, in terms of, are there other drugs that you think ought to be legalized besides marijuana?
Currently, we're not looking at that aspect, and we, from our campaign perspective, would like to see criminal justice reform with helping people instead of punishing people. I actually have a family member who needed to get assistance with drug abuse, and I drove him around all day long, and this was in 2008, in order to get him into a program. And he wasn't able to get into a program, and he had to wait 6 months in order for him to get assistance. And when it comes to a drug abuser, they need assistance immediately when they are ready to go. And he unfortunately wasn't able to get assistance, and he's still lucky to be alive today. So I think we need to look at it from a medical perspective instead of a criminal perspective. And so right now we're not running to legalize all drugs or anything like that, but I think we need to have some sort of reform in order to ensure that people are able to get the assistance that they need.
Well, I raise it because the opioid epidemic
Right.
is a national problem. It's
Yep.
a problem I've heard here in Kansas, and obviously that ties into the whole drug issue.
No, part of that problem is I think the state is cracking down on doctors prescribing opioids, and so if you're in a lot of pain and your doctor's not going to give you your oxycodone, what do you do then?
Well, that actually is also creating a black market in
Exactly.
Colorado. So in Colorado, they're seeing the prices of cannabis come down, but then the prices of opioids are increasing, and so you're actually having drug dealers dealing opioids now. And so that's actually something that was brought to my attention just a few weeks ago from a supporter of mine who lives in Colorado. He's like, well, I think you need to look at this perspective on the opioid crisis, and restricting doctors is not a good solution because that's also going to create a black market as well.
And I think also that in Colorado, you know, they do get quite a bit of tax revenue from marijuana, but there's still a black market, I understand, to avoid those taxes. So,
Right.
and we've had incidents where, like the poor guy in New York City who was selling single cigarettes because there's so much tax on cigarettes. There's a black market for cigarettes, and of course, that led to an escalation with police, and an example of, well, that's not really a criminal justice reform issue, but more of a police issue, but how very minor crimes can sometimes escalate into big life-changing events. Let's take another commercial break on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV again. Bob Weeks, your host, Carl Peterson, and our guest this week is Kansas gubernatorial candidate Jeff Caldwell. Jeff, we've had Chris Kobach on this show, and he does support a constitutional amendment or some method to give Kansans the right of initiative and reform at the statewide level. And I think that's something that you endorse also.
Yes, and one aspect that I look at it is the Tyson chicken plant. Earlier this year, or late last year, there was a secret handshake behind closed doors at the city level between Leavenworth and Tyson. And it came to
So
light.
it's Leavenworth County, is that right?
Right.
And Tonganoxie.
Correct,
was the city.
Tonganoxie, yes.
Down here, we don't really know too much about where those things
Right,
are.
But,
yes.
but we've got to differentiate. There's a big difference between Leavenworth County and
Correct.
the city of Leavenworth.
Yes.
One's a municipality and one's a county.
It was
and as a former
Tonga,
county
yes.
commissioner, I'll guarantee you that never the twain shall meet.
Yeah, I was in Tonganoxie, and they had a secret deal behind closed doors with non-disclosure agreements between the city council and Tyson, and they were going to announce that Tyson was going to come in and have a major chicken coop plant in order to have a huge factory and expand revenue within the city. Well, the citizens heard about it, and there was an outcry because of the health reasons, the smell, and pollution, and all these other reasons why the citizens didn't want it. Well, the Tyson deal fell through. They didn't come to Tonganoxie. They didn't go to Leavenworth County. And so what happened a few months later is in the state legislature, they passed a bill that would allow for the same exact idea to occur within the state of Kansas. And so instead of it being null and void at the city level, later down the road, the state just passed the same legislation in order to allow for a company like Tyson to come into the state and implement a new factory. That's where if we have initiative and ballot reform for citizens to counter this, I believe that this type of legislation would not exist any longer.
Well, let me ask you, referendum is the other side of initiative and referendum. And Kansas has very weak laws in this regard. For most of the states west of the Mississippi have initiative and referendum. There are a few east. But if you were going to implement either initiative or referendum, and there is municipal initiative statute here in Kansas, it is very attenuated by the courts, but it does exist statutorily. Where would you begin?
Well, we would have to have a constitutional amendment, first of all. And so in order to allow for our state constitution to allow for citizens to have this type of power, we have to bring forth the constitutional amendment in order to allow for ballot reform within the citizens bringing forth a referendum.
So that involves changing the hearts and minds of 2/3 of each of the members of the House and
Correct.
separately 2/3 of the members of the Senate, and then the people vote just yay or nay, a majority. Governor doesn't have a direct role in the process, except in his role as a leader,
Correct.
and, bully pulpit and things like that. And Joan Finney was in favor of that, but it didn't work out quite for her. Kind of a related issue, maybe, that our Constitution could use a change in is the idea of a rainy day fund. Now, we have a ending balance law in Kansas which says that we should have a certain amount of money left over at the end of the year, but the legislature routinely waives that. We've had situations where when Sam Brownback came in office, we had a lot of money in that ending balance, and the legislature cut taxes, didn't cut spending, and in 2 years that balance was gone. A rainy day fund would be much more strict and stringent about how that has to be funded and how that money can be spent. Do you think that would help us?
I definitely support a rainy day fund. And I don't know exactly how it would have affected the outcome of the Brownback experiment, because it could have allowed him to even go further. Because,
Possibly.
you know, you never know. It could have been something that he took advantage of with the legislature in not playing ball and continue to make drastic changes within our budget. But I definitely support it because it allows for the state to have funds for emergency purposes. And that's something that is very important. I don't understand why Kansas doesn't have it. There's only a handful of states that don't have
and we
it.
are one. So, for example, like a common example is about 10 years ago when there was the national recession, we implemented a 1 cent sales tax in Kansas, an extra 1 cent, to get us through that time. But if we had had a rainy day fund, we perhaps could have spent from that rather than having to raise that sales tax.
Well, the question I'd throw out to you is, do you think the idea of cutting taxes is dead? Was the Brownback experiment a failure, and how would you, if you looking backwards, how would you, if you'd been governor in 2011, 2012, would you supported legislation to cut state taxes?
Oh yeah, I'm running to cut taxes right now, and it depends on what taxes you're talking about. Right now, I want to abolish the tax on food and water. That's a bipartisan issue. The Republicans and Democrats both support that. I want to lower private property taxes. That's a huge burden on farmers and ranchers and factory owners. It's a really big situation within the state of Kansas. So I believe that most Kansans support those two types of tax cuts. I also believe that we need to cut enough government spending responsibly first, and then cut the personal taxes later, like corporate taxes, and I want to abolish the income tax, but we're not going to get there until we cut enough government spending.
Yeah. Karl, let's take our last commercial break for today. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. Bob Weeks, your host, Karl Peterjohn, and Kansas candidate for governor Jeff Caldwell for the Libertarian Party. So one of the things the next governor will likely preside over is redistricting. We'll have the 2020 census, and a year or two after that, we need to draw up new districts, our congressional districts, but also state, House, and Senate. Last time, the legislature could not agree on a plan, and the courts had to do it. What would you like to see going forward as to how to have a good redistricting outcome next time?
I would like to see a total separate entity, a nonprofit or some sort of outside non-political organization redistrict our districts, because right now gerrymandering is a really big issue. And I actually I'm a 3rd district coordinator for Libertarian Party of Kansas, and I lived in Wyandotte County for a couple years. And when they were talking about doing this, they were talking about taking Wyandotte County out of the 3rd district, keeping Douglas, Johnson, and then go all Miami County, and I would have been completely just washed away within that system. So,
and it seems like Wyandotte County is much more in common with Johnson County economically and everything than it does with Lawrence.
Right. And so that's where, you have Miami County becoming more influential within the 3rd district, which is more of a Republican county than Wyandotte County. So that was actually very interesting to learn about what they were thinking, because Kevin Yoder's Republican, and he represents the 3rd district. So I think that there was some sort of influential ideology behind the thought process that they were thinking, but I don't understand why we should have politicians in charge of this process. We need to take them out.
I think that is a good idea, that redistricting is when politicians get to choose their voters rather than the other way around.
Right.
Carl?
You're going to let professors do it instead? I think back.
Professors.
Well, I think back where the experts are going to come from to do the selecting.
Not
Bob.
experts
That's a really good
but
question.
just people who would be fairer and not really do it for partisan electoral reasons.
Well,
I think.
I think, I don't agree with everything Orman says, but I liked his answer last week with the computer. So
let me ask you how you differentiate yourself from the other candidates. And one of the candidates, in fact, one of the better known independents, described himself as a fiscal conservative, social liberal.
Sure.
How would you differentiate yourself from say, Mr. Orman?
Well, I was actually very surprised at his answer last week on his economic plan, where he wanted to have quid pro quo within the government. That creates so much corruption. I was shocked that he said that. I was like, I can't believe he just said that on an interview, because what that does is it creates backdoor deals between politicians and corporations. Because what he basically was talking about is, well, you're going to have an economic policy put in place in order to bring a corporation in, and you need to make sure that it's done within a timely manner so you actually have collusion with the government. And so that was actually something that was very interesting to me. That's something that I don't want to see happen. I am the only candidate that is running with these 4 planks all together: cut taxes, cut spending, legalize cannabis, and defend the Second Amendment. There is no other candidate on the ballot that is running with those 4 planks combined.
Let me ask you, we only have a little bit of time left. You'd mentioned spending and trying to get a handle on spending. Where would you begin looking at the Kansas budget in terms of spending? And should the Kansas Supreme Court be setting state school spending levels?
So when it comes to our education funding, I would like to implement a bill called the Kansas Education Liberty Act. It was only passed in about 1/10 of its existence, and so it doesn't exist very much at all. And so what it does is it creates nonprofit organizations that allows for representation of each type of schooling: homeschool, public school, private school, charter school. Each nonprofit organizations would be in charge of handling the funding, but it's a dollar for dollar tax credit for the donations. So that's what incentivizes people to fund it. But then it also ties the money from that nonprofit organization to each child. And then it allows for that child to go to whatever school they want within the state of Kansas. And that creates competition within the marketplace. And instead of having a top-down funding system, we have a bottom-up funding system. It creates more competition, streamlines education funding, and it cuts out the bureaucracy found within the education system. But I also, again, am running to satisfy the Supreme Court's ruling for the school funding increase by sports betting, cannabis, and full legalization of hemp. And so I think that the Supreme Court needs to look at a whole package that brings freedom to the table, and if they don't like it, that's when we have to get them out.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me follow up in the few seconds we have left. Would you support there's a lot of talk about school scholarships or vouchers. Is that something that would be part of that plan you described, or is that separate or would be different and you would not support it?
I think it's something that is actually intertwined with it. There's multiple funding aspects within the Kansas Education Liberty Act that allows for each types of funding to exist. So it's actually a lot of different types of systems available.
If I could summarize that, it does sound like you're in favor of school choice.
Yes,
is that right?
definitely.
Okay, so just so we know that.
Yes.
Well, anyway, so we are out of time for today. They're going to turn the lights out in a moment. So thank you, Karl, for your insight today. And Jeff Caldwell, thank you for
very much.
appearing on Wichita Liberty
Thank you.
TV. That's all for this week. We'll see you again next week.